So sorry about that. We display port adapters. So my name's Shawn. I guess I have to stand behind the podium to have everybody hear me. But I work at RedHat out of the CTO office, so I'm the chief security strategist. I guess that's what passes as a CISO of Red Hat Federal. And my day job is to write all of our security policies. So anything from like the DoD STIG to common criteria to making sure FIPS gets done. And the idea was to spend like the next 45 minutes to an hour chatting about what are we doing in security automation, what are we doing with the STIGs, how are we making software evaluations faster, and then what tools exist today that people can go home and use right now, as well as what are we doing with NSA, just FSO, to try and make this whole thing better moving forward. So is that kind of the interesting agenda? Make sure we're on. All right. So part of the reason it needed to be this laptop is about 50%, 60% of what we're going to be doing is going through demos. So a couple slides to show some, why don't we call it academic background of it, and then actually showing the tools, showing the processes, going through and sticking a box live. And then somewhere in the mix, we'll chat about this. So while I work at Red Hat, part of this role is actually, Red Hat's not officially a CETA, but we sit on the DoD CIO Council as an advisor. So I'll kind of intermix what we're doing in terms of government plans with NIST, government plans with DISA. So I'll kind of bounce back and forth between these two hats. So the motivation for all of this is Red Hat version 5, Red Hat Linux 5 came out 4 or 5 years ago. And the challenge we have with it is when we stick it for DoD purposes, there's roughly like 600 compliance items. None of them are automated. So even if you're the best of the best and you can do like one checklist item a minute, it's still going to take you like 8 hours to certify a single Linux virtual machine. And then how do we scale that across an enterprise? And we just can't. So the idea is not only do we have to create some automation, but the whole process of creating a STIG, it took us about 5.5 years after the time Red Hat 5 came out to get DoD CIO to sign off. So not only do we have like this manual security attestation problem, but it took us 5.5 years before DoD could even adopt the technology. And while we're talking about Red Hat today, this extends to VMware and Microsoft and others. So the challenge is there's really like these 4 primary processes to getting a STIG, if you will. The first is we have to do what's called common criteria. And the idea is common criteria gets convoluted a lot, but when a vendor makes a promise about we will audit privileged user actions, or if a bad guy does a thing, it has an audit log that can stand up in court. We have to make these attestations, and a third-party lab goes in and validates all of them. So it's a third-party code source code review, a third-party functional review, and once we do all of that, we go back into DoD or NIST or the civilian agency, and basically they give us a spreadsheet. They're like, okay, we can trust your product does what it says, but we need to do secure passwords, and we're going to define that as upper, lower, left, right characters, things like that. And that says for the RHEL 5, there's like 600 checklist items. We then convert that into a Red Hat specific implementation. Go check this file for this value, or click this button and turn it left. And that is what a STIG does. And then we finally wrap all of that up in a bow and take it either to DoD CIO or to DISA FSO for kind of a stamp of approval to use across Army, Navy, CCOM, so forth. So the challenge to kind of rehash all of this is for RHEL 5, it was 5.5 years. For RHEL 6, we ended up getting through common criteria in just over a year. DISA had the requirements pre-written for us, and while we were in common criteria, the 800 days, we used it to actually write the STIG. But then it took us nearly 4 months to get it through all of the DoD approvals. So we went from effectively 5.5 years to 2.5. So we 50% improvement. For the RHEL 6, we went from like 600 checks to 250, so we cut it down, made it smaller. But there was still a 2.5 year delay for Red Hat 6, which came out roughly 2 years ago. So we're just now seeing adoption across DoD. There's a couple pockets, we're in tactical vehicles, but those are generally by exception. So the challenge then is how do we get to this fully automated baseline, or what we call zero-day STIG. So when a technology vendor releases something, the time it's released, it should actually have security guidance published with DoD. And we did that. So kind of the story from this point on is how we did that. as well as how we're automating it. So we can actually do things like deploy directly into the STIG without having to validate it, without having to get your security control assessors to come in behind your dev or operation guys and spend like 3 days doing security evaluations. So maybe that's a good spot for a pause. Am I on the right track? This is kind of interesting. I'm judging by head nods. So, good. So what we ended up doing, and when I say we, yeah.
So you mentioned that it's just got to the point where it was compliant, but haven't we been using RedHat for stuff like our vulnerability assessment tools that we've been using?
Yeah.
We've been using it.
So the question was, we're just getting to a point for Red Hat 6, but some people are using it like vulnerability assessment tools like ACAS can scan it. The SPAWAR, they call it SCC or the SCAP compliance checker. So some tools and content exist today, but it's largely deployed by exception than it is by like a blanket certificate of networthiness, a blanket DoD approval. So what we ended up doing, and by we, I define that as Red Hat, NSA IAD, or the Information Assurance Directorate, DISA FSO, and NIST. We got together and we said, hey, it's taking too long to develop STIGs, like 5.5 years, 2.5 years, this is really ridiculous. So why don't we create an open source community to pull in DoD, academia, and vendors to start working together on developing high quality guidance, and use open source, instead of just for developing technology, use open source to develop, well, policy. So we put everything on GitHub, and that was about 3.5 years ago. So as we move forward now, we have participation from, well, again, the core stakeholders, DISA, NIST, Army Research Labs, and then even interestingly, third parties like VMware and Oracle. And the idea is we've created an open source development community that anybody can actually use to influence the STIG. So if you're an operator and you think a security control will break your box, you can actually submit a patch for review, and then Red Hat will actually ship it in the next service pack, in the next update. So it allows this kind of spiral development to happen with STIGs and automation. So now this community is, it's about 155 people as of last night, when it pulled the numbers. So we have these participations, and we're actually incrementally developing the STIG on averages about, 10 changes a day. So bug fixes, security errata, maybe some security guidance rule is not very clear, like it's too ambiguous, so we can create defining language to make it very purposeful. And then Red Hat's role in all of this is we actually take this body of content and we work with DISA and NIST to what's called certify it. So the challenge has been, developing things on the internet, and now I'm supposed to use that thing on the internet to security harden my baseline and get accreditation. I want some peer review of this process. So we do it in a couple ways. The first is we go to DISA FSO and we present them our body of documentation, and they kind of step through it and validate it for DoD purposes. We also then take it to NIST, and they go through and make sure for NIST 853 accreditations or the NIST risk management framework you may have heard of, we actually map it back to all of that. So NIST will kind of validate that we do the right NIST 853 controls, that they're implemented correctly, and when both parties agree, we go ahead and ship it natively in Linux. I'm flying through because we got a little bit of a late start.
That's a question.
Yeah.
How often do you take it to NIST? I mean, it sounds like it's a constantly evolving process.
Yep.
You have to have cutoffs, right?
So the question was, how often do we take it to NIST? So in the development community, we're doing 10 changes a day, roughly. So approximately every quarter, every 90 days, we snapshot it. We take it to NIST and DISA, both of them, as well as NSA's Information Assurance Directorate. We go through an approval process, and then we ship it in RHEL. So from a consumption standpoint, every time Red Hat comes out with a service pack, like Red Hat 7.1 or 7.2 or 7.3, we rebase all of this. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that good? What do you guys think of that?
Well, how does that, is this just for Red Hat or for application developers who make stuff that's on top of it?
I'll show you both. So right now we're talking about Linux, just because I have to talk about one thing at a time usually. But content exists for the Tomcat web server, for the JBoss application server, for Java JRE, for Webmin, which is a system management tool. We're developing it for OpenStack as well. And then this morning we just started working on Docker. So that's kind of bleeding news that we're releasing the STIG for Docker. Yeah.
Shawn, I'm confused. Are you developing the STIGs, or are you developing a tool that checks to see if your system is STIG?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, so both. The question was, are we developing STIGs or like automation? You're going all over the place. Clarify for me. So we're actually doing both. So on one side, when we developed STIGs, we have basically, classically, this like 500-page PDF guide. And you take the PDF and you have some security control assessor who types a command, compares it to expected output, and it's like this catalog of nerd knobs for a product. You have one for Windows, Linux, VMware, and so forth. The challenge has been, how do we keep that body of security checklists up to date with common threats? Like, why are we still checking file permissions but we're ignoring the firewall? Or why are we not auditing for this kind of malware signature that came out last week? Like, how do we keep this up to date? So for that, we develop content, just core content. To ingest that content, you need tools. So some of them are already in place, like ACAS, right? So we can take our content, ingest it into ACAS, and you continue on your merry way. You can also use tools that are shipping natively in the operating system, which are just interpreters, kind of like ACAS. You get your red light, green light, and I'll show one in just a minute. Does that help? All right. So the idea is moving on to actual demos. So part of the more interesting part of this is actually seeing it to make all of this a little bit real. So we talked about open source. We talked about this project. We talked about automation. But now let's actually show, like, how do we perform a vulnerability scan? How do we get STIG content onto Linux? How do we tailor that profile? So if I have the DoD STIG, maybe I'm running a mission environment on like a tactical vehicle, or maybe I have some special application that a third of the rules don't apply to me for some reason. So how do I tailor this automation so that I don't get false positives, so I'm not dinged on things that aren't relevant to me? A really good example is in the DoD, in the Linux STIGs, it has you PKI enable web servers. But if I don't have a web server enabled, I'm not going to find that check relevant to me. So how do I just like uncheck it to make sure it's not held against me? Make sure I don't get a false finding about that. And then the other part of all this, which is the last component, is whenever we go into the DoD space, we have a body of documentation we need to submit, like our certification paperwork. And as one of those artifacts, there is something called a requirements traceability matrix. And when it comes down to it, it's basically like a spreadsheet. So somebody in security gives you a spreadsheet of like NIST 153 controls, or in the old days it used to be DSCID 6.3, DoD 8500. So how do we pre-populate that spreadsheet with the security controls I chose? And how do we do that based on the profile I selected? So if I do DoD STIG, I want to pre-populate all of the STIG NIST 100 controls. If I pre-populate something like C2S, which is the JWorks version of Amazon for the intelligence DoD community, how do I pre-populate all of that? So is that kind of interesting to see? Yeah. Cool. So with that, why don't I get out of here? I had to reboot to make all the resolutions work, so I'll go ahead and pull up my demo VM. And then while it's loading, once we do that, the other element that we kind of wanted to show, go ahead and boot this here. So the other element that we wanted to show was how to deploy directly into a known configuration state. So the challenge has been, if I go between different programs, different PEOs, every single one has a different method of hardening their machine. So if I jump from Army to Navy as a broad example, how do I ensure that the Navy is doing the STIGs just like the Army, just like the Air Force? And for that, we actually now have the ability in Linux to provision directly into STIG compliance. So what I'll show is how to provision the operating system directly in, mostly because the OS provides the foundation for everything else, right? Your virtualization, your app servers, your middleware. But we also have the ability to extend that to include deploying your app server directly into a STIG, or your hypervisor, like OpenStack, directly in. So I'll kind of bounce between the two. So it looks like the demo is up. So let me make sure this is mostly visible. So when I was told to come and give a tech brief, so I figured out, well, a tech brief means drop to the command line, right? Like that's what to do. So I'll try and kind of elevate the conversation in certain parts and also retain some command line stuff. So it's like half the room's head nodding and half the room's not. So I'll try and bounce between the two. So what we ended up doing is in DoD, most people know about DoD ACAS. It's a scanner. It gets you your red light, green light. A lot of people use it. And that's arguably not going away. It's fine. We're not like trying to compete with that. But what we ended up doing in the operating system is shipping a configuration compliance scanner natively, without having to use ACAS, without having to use Tenable or Tripwire or something like that. And we just called it OpenSCAP. It's an acronym of acronyms, not too relevant for here. And on the operating system, we ship what's called, well, we ship a bunch of profiles. And without getting into too many of them, we ship one for PCI compliance, which is largely used for commercial guys. We ship one for C2S, so anybody running on CIA's JWICs of EC2. And we also ship some for the DoD STIGs. So for now, why don't we go ahead and actually just take a look at the STIG itself. So I'm going to skip through all the nerdier parts of the commands, eval. So I can give the command line tool a profile. Afcea, I can give it a report. I can tell it to spit out machine readable results. And then I tell it where my content is. So while I go through, this really isn't so interesting. A sysadmin would love it, right? I get my red light, green light, I get my pass or fail, I can get immediate results. So while this runs, all it's doing is just it's running a STIG compliance scan, making sure different settings are installed, making sure they're running and operating to some different file permissions. Not too much to see here unless you're like a sysadmin. So while it does run, we can actually take a look at what's going on. So in the background, it's running a scan. But the question is, like, you just threw a bunch of command line stuff. I don't know what the hell I'm scanning. What's going on here? So we ship these HTML prose guides. In this case, it's the one for the DoD STIG. And it's just what you would think of as like a privileged user guide. It goes through, it has a table of contents, has a table of contents, checking file permissions, checking audit rules, things like that, and it will give you feedback on your compliance state. So it's still running in the background here, and you can see I'm failing a bunch of things. When this gets done, it actually generates this HTML report you're looking at right now. So this is generally something like a sysadmin would send to his manager, or you can even ingest it directly into ACAS if you so chose. And you get your pass or fail, your red light, green light. So if I go ahead and click on something, not only do I tell if I pass or failed, I also tell the rationale behind the check. So for this one, it's making sure that you have cryptographic signatures on your updates. Like, make sure your updates are coming from RedHat, not the Chinese or something like this. As we go forward, I failed this one, and one of the things we ended up doing is, for the sysadmins, we embed remediation. So the question is like, okay, I get this red light, green light report. That's fine, but how do I turn all of the red lights into green lights? Like, what do I do? So in your HTML, in your report, you can copy and paste like a script if you so chose. That's fine. But what we also ended up doing is, if you notice, I have. So actually, let me take a pause. Is this useful for everybody? People know this existed, or is this kind of new? Mostly new. So this whole project is actually, it's shipping inside of Red Hat Linux 7. It's shipping today. It's not a futures thing. It's also shipping in Red Hat 6.4 and above. So it's been deployed in Linux for a while. And I mentioned it's actually, NIST has what they call the NIST validated tools. Let's see if the internet works here. Apparently not. So we put it through NIST, and it's a formal recognized DoD and civilian configuration scanner, just like ACAS or Tripwire or anything else would be. NIST, part of the challenge was they didn't want random configuration scanners out on the network, so DoD and NSA named NIST kind of the certifying body of all the scanners. So we put it through attestation, so it's not kind of this willy-nilly tool. So as we go in here, I get my pass or fails. So on this command, you'll notice I just had what's called the evaluation. So I'm skipping a little bit of detail. What I can actually end up doing, if I so chose, is the question would be like, how do I turn all the red lights to the green lights? I just give it an additional flag, a -- remediate, and it will go ahead and execute those remediations on my box and rerun the scan so everything turns green. So, yeah.
So if I deployed a Red Hat server with no just default configurations, I ran this with remediate, it would go through and completely, turn all those reds to greens, depending on what kind of profile I put in there?
Yep, and we're going to do that right now. So why don't we create a -fixed report? So -fixed. So this is actually my production dev machine. So it's going to stick it. So it does a couple things. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, go ahead.
So it does a couple of things. It will first do an initial scan, and we basically need to know what to fix, right? So we scan the box, we see what to fix, and we write everything to a temp file. It's just an external temp file. We then parse it for all the fails, and within all of the fails, it embeds this remediation script. It will go ahead and execute that, and then rescan the box.
So this is it generates its own report, but I don't want to have to go to every single box and get the reports from here. Is there a way to ingest this into my current vulnerability scanning?
Yep. So the question was, like, it's really cool you're showing one machine, but I got like 1,000 machines, guy. So what do I do? This is worthless. Not worthless, but I need something to scale. So yes, I'll show that in a minute. So you can actually import all this into ACAS. There's APIs to send it into Red Hat System Management tooling, something called Red Hat Satellite. I'll show that in just a minute. So here it did all of that first pass, and now it's starting that remediation. So it's going through and doing all those scripts. So while it does that, let me take a break. So that's pretty useful for you guys. Do you guys do the hardening yourself, or are you the guys who like review the security process once it's done? Some have. All right, cool. So why don't I see if I can hop on the internet? It's running here. Great. So if that worked, I should now be on the internet. Okay. So as you see, it's running, and now it's just showing everything is fixed. So again, it's not necessarily the sexiest demo, but when you realize like, oh, I just stick my box with one command, that's a bit more interesting now. If we take a step back, Stigging a box used to be like I'd have to write my own scripts, and somebody else wrote their own scripts, and then Army, Navy, Air Force wrote their own, Booz, Lockheed, Harris wrote their own. So it created this really big problem where third-party accreditors for like command readiness reviews, like you're going to see different implementations for the same stig. So now we have a way to standardize that. From a Red Hat perspective, what this also meant is allowing us to go in as big Red Hat and say we can blanket make a support statement that says if you want to learn how to stig your box, we'll help you. If you already stig your box, you're still in support. It's no big deal because now we standardized it and support it. So now if I go through here, I should see a report that says Afcea fixed. There's a couple things that might still be failing. The first is we do not, well, it turns out I did it. We do not repartition your machine. That would be very dangerous. We're not going to mess with your file systems. We're like absolutely not. So yeah, if you don't have your partitions set up, we don't mess with your data. Absolutely not. It's too scary. What if we repartition something that shouldn't be? I'm not going to touch it. But for everything else, there's a couple things. For one, I'm not connected to the internet, so I can't verify that the GPG check is Red Hat's hash. So we can run scans what are called online, which is like, hey, let me query redhat.com, get the latest crypto keys, make sure it's what's matching. I was supposed to be on the internet, so I did it that way. Most people are disconnected, like entirely. So there's an offline way to do this as well. So I wanted to kind of note that really quick. But everything else, you see just a bunch of green lights. Because it is my dev box, I did write a couple of exceptions, and I'll show you how I did that in just a minute. So this is kind of like an Easter egg in the presentation. So the idea is I ran a scan, I did -- remediate, but I prefaced all of that with showing like, well, what if I don't want a couple of these rules to be applicable to me? Like, how do I make that happen? So for me, I have a really bad habit of like, I install a lot of third-party software. Like we're Red Hat, we have ISV ecosystem, we want to test their stuff out. Even Oracle requires you to install things as a root. So I did not want to be locked out if I fat-fingered the root password too many times. That's just up to me. So the question is like, how do I take the DoD content that's blessed and create waivers? So is that kind of an interesting use case now? All right. So what we ended up doing is we wrote a GUI tool, and it's actually the only GUI tool Red Hat has that works on Mac, Linux, and Windows. So I can choose what operating system I want to run, RHEL, CentOS, things like this. And I can choose my profile. So we ship one for the FBI, we ship one for national security systems, we ship the DoD STIG, so we can choose, I don't know, STIG for server for this example. And then I can choose customize. I give it a name, Afcea. The naming is really ugly. There's a technical reason it's an XML namespace, but for this purpose, we're not going to get into that. So I'm presented with a window now where I have a bunch of checkboxes. So instead of altering bash scripts or Perl scripts or like XML, all I end up doing is I can go ahead and say, I don't know, I'm not going to hold myself to any password requirements because I don't have any local users. Maybe I'm just a dummy sensor in the back of a Humvee or a SIGINT platform. Like I don't have users. I'm just going to ignore this. So at this point, I'm just randomly checking and unchecking things. So I click and I click and I click, and I determine like, okay, I'm good. I've made my selections. I want to save this somewhere. So all I end up doing is confirming my changes. I get brought back to a screen, and now I can go to File Save. So why don't I just call this Afcea, for lack of a better term. So this is a little bit nerdy now. So for the actual ops guys, it's important to answer a couple things. So the STIG is machine code now. It's all automated. So we want to break down a couple components really quickly. So what I ended up doing is I created this little profile and I called it -Afcea. It's just my tailoring file, my customization file, and I can, in code, I can see that it extends the official DoD state. So now I have a machine-readable way to say I took the DISA policy, I extended it, and here's all the changes I made to it. So I can kind of verify my originating source and my deltas, and then we can actually cryptographically sign this. So we can do integrity checking that says, like, no, I do extend the official DoD policy. Here's my changes. It's all crypto signed. So as I go through, so all we end up doing in code is you'll notice this selected equals false. I just unchecked it, right? Selected equals false. So now I can go through and see that I unchecked every the password expiration requirements. I unchecked the group account expiration requirements, so selected false. So that's all we have to do to tailor a state. So is that kind of interesting for you guys? Yeah.
Is there any way to work backwards a little bit? Like, let's say you did this and it just pulled everything you're trying to do. You figure out what you need to put a waiver on.
So I heard half. So how do we work backwards? Like
if I did this remediate and it just a program to stop running.
Yeah. Oh. So if I did a remediate and I broke my box, like what do I do?
Yeah.
Don't break your box. So right now it's a harder answer than we'd like. What we ended up doing is we had this ideology that said whatever we ship, we need to enable with natively available tools. So for remediation, that meant the languages, like we could only use scripting languages, Bash, Python, Perl, stuff that ships on Linux. And there really is no undo button for that. So it's largely why we say scan your box, look at the results. You can do a -- accept, so you could actually accept yourself from different remediations. There is the ability to do that, and that's what we have today. It is, it's not quite a sledgehammer, but maybe it's like a rubber mallet. So somewhere in the middle. What we're moving towards is using something called Ansible, which is a full configuration management language that does have undo capabilities. So that will probably be shipping in RedHat 7.4, which is our next service pack. But I didn't show it because it gets into the future and people generally want to hear what they have today. So today it's rubber mallet, like there is no undo. Tomorrow we'll use something called Ansible. But it's very similar like Puppet, Chef, other config management tools. And then I think you had a question as well. How do you can you use this Diploma Proof? Yes. So what we end up doing is, I'm skipping a little bit in the sake of time, but we can actually add what's called a justification field. So if I go through this GUI tool, hit customize, I can. So I need to start over on my demo here. Pick some given rule. I didn't start the way that I needed to demo it, so I don't know. Start over. Picking some arbitrary profile. I get my little GUI. I already tailored it, which is why it's not letting me. But there's actually a field specifically called Waiver, so that we can say it's free-form text. I unchecked the password requirements because I have a POAM through August, or this isn't relevant to me for mission need, or whatever. And when you do that, it'll actually pull up in your HTML report, and it will say not applicable. Instead of pass or fail, it will come up and say not applicable, and then it will have your justification.
And those customizations map when I import this into ACAP?
They all do. So underneath the covers, so the question was like, if I import this into ACAS, do I lose any of my waivers or tailoring or whatever? Underneath the covers, part of why that NIST certification is so important is it standardizes a format for all of our reports. It's called SCAP. It's an XML specification. So the idea is it will capture my pass or fail. It will capture the severity, like a Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3. And one of those fields is an open text called description. So your reports, we actually just did this with Tenable for their security center, which is what ACAS is. So it comes up. It doesn't directly call it a waiver in security center. I think it comes as like a custom note field or something like this. So you have to know how to look for it in your tool, but the data itself will be there. So specifically for all the like admin ops guys, we use something called SCAP 1.2. So it's the same protocol that you can import into Tripwire, Tenable, RedHat, Microsoft SCAP. There's another tool as well. Is that helpful? Cool. And then, so where was I? Ran a scan, did some tailoring, got a report, answered about changes like rollback. So today rollback is a no-no, just because it's bash. Tomorrow we'll be using Ansible or config management language. So yes, if you're interested in seeing that rollback, I can show you like on the side, but I don't want to do it right now. And then the other element of all this. So what did we answer? What didn't we answer? So right now we did a scan for configuration items like password length and audit rules, but that's only half the problem. The other half is how to do like a vulnerability scan, like an IAVA scan, the CVE scan. So how do I do that? It's actually the same tool, and let me see if I can hop online. I'll try one more time here. One second. All right. Good was down. Yeah, it's not gonna let me. Let me see if I have one locally down here. So unfortunately, I can't necessarily show it, but what RedHat ends up doing is DISA publishes IAVums every quarter, roughly, plus or minus. Like on paper, it's every 90 days. RedHat publishes them twice a day. So we do it at a little bit more frequency. So what I end up doing is I can show like how to pull down all the vulnerability feeds from RedHat. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, just can't get the internet's working. So I can't show how to pull it down. But when you do, you get a configuration, or a vulnerability report where it's, I don't know why we don't do red, it shows up as orange. So it's an orange and green, where there's a good demarcation point. So you can actually see these are things I do not have patched. The green are things that are. And then it links it back to CVEs, which is a vulnerability system that NIST manages. So if there's a vulnerability for, say, Apache, it gets a unique identifier, and NIST says, okay, this vulnerability for Apache is expressed this way on Linux, it's expressed this way on Windows, so we can track it back to kind of how NIST does it. When we run a scan, we actually have the ability to both do the configuration, like audit, passwords, kind of the mundane, as well as the binary vulnerabilities like kernels and web servers, are they vulnerable as well? And the idea is, if we take a step back to like Heartbleed and all the SSL vulnerabilities, people would do things like update their SSL versions or OpenSSL versions, but they would forget to phase off the old cryptography algorithms from the web server. So they'd have the new patched version, but their web server was still using old antiquated algorithms. They're still vulnerable. So in this way, we can actually marry configuration guidance with binary vulnerability management all in one scan. So is that kind of useful? Is that helpful? All right.
Is this what came out as
Yep. Yeah, it's still the same tool. It's just scanning something different, right? So instead of scanning password links, it's scanning CVEs. So that's kind of cool, kind of nice. And then the very last thing I think I got is just a couple minutes is that's why I can't get on the Wi-Fi. It's attached to a Wi-Fi. It's attached to an area. Well, look at that. Well, I'm already past the point of no return, so it's not as useful. So what we, kind of the last thing I wanted to show was, why don't I go ahead and boot this here, is this is CD. So this is just, when it loads here, I'll try and make the screen resolution bigger in just a minute. So the idea is like, okay, I had a Linux machine, I ran some stuff on the command line, great, but like, what if I'm just deploying all my things right now? I'm spinning up 100 virtual machines, or even one. How do I like stick it from the get-go? How do I do it from the beginning? Looks like there's a resolution kind of issue, so why don't I try this in 1 second here. It's not really showing even on my side. So you can loosely make out something that says security right here. So what we ended up doing is in the installer, again, I apologize for all the resolution, but we can actually click one. You'll just have to trust that this one says Stig, and we just hit apply, and I'm done. That's it, and it will even do the partitioning because it's doing it from the install instead of like retroactively. So great. Now I hit my profile I chose. Like I could even switch it. So I just did Stig, but maybe I want to go to PCI compliance fictitiously. It'll go ahead and reharden to that baseline, and then when I hit done, that's it. So the question then is like, well, not everybody uses a graphical installer for their Linux machines. Like we Kickstart it, we do automated builds. Underneath the covers, this resolution is all kinds of not so fun right now. Yeah, sorry, it's just not ideal. So underneath the covers, we have, for the people who are using Kickstarts, you can actually add this into your Kickstart down near the bottom, where you tell it your content, so you can use the ones RedHat ships natively. You can even ingest it, like if a system integrator is building something for you and they give you a custom profile, you can ingest theirs. And then you choose what profile, so PCI compliance, DoD Stig, and it will go ahead and just do the same thing I did in the GUI, where it's provisioning directly to your configuration state. So is that useful? Yeah.
Can you go back once? CVE compliance, how did you run that? Or just like the function?
I heard only half. How did I run this?
How do you run the CVE compliance? Compliance?
Yeah.
How did you actually get that?
So now that I am online, RedHat CVE. I'll show you. So the question was like, how do I do the vulnerability scans that you guys just showed me? So since I am online, I'll go ahead and share this as if you were connected to the internet. So while it's slow, twice a day, RedHat releases our vulnerability metrics. So if there's any 0 days that came out in the morning, if something got found at lunch, we just want to release twice a day, assuming there's something to release in the first place. And we publish it on a web page. So people can go and either download this and like one-way transfer it to the high side. A lot of people write it as like a script to do like an automated download, whatever, however you want to get it. Yeah, it's again not the best idea. So when I click here, you'll actually be brought to what's called a repository, where you can choose, are you on Red Hat Linux 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? Are you on JBoss? You can even get a vulnerability feed of every Red Hat vulnerability for every Red Hat version, every Red Hat product, if you were so inclined. And you can get it in one file. So if I go ahead, I might have a copy locally. I do, actually. So all I end up doing is I just give it that. So it is. I can send kind of all the backup slides with all the commands and stuff like that. But the idea is I just give it a evaluation. So instead of like a -- profile Stig, I just give it my feed of vulnerability. I actually want to be root when I do this. There I go. And it generates, so right now, these probably mean nothing to you. Like these are just Red Hat security announcements, like enumerations. On the back end, it generates this HTML report. Is that kind of useful, kind of cool?
So do you have to, the next step from this, did it take care of those problems, or now you have to go
if I do the -- remediate, it will go ahead and, the challenge with that is, like, it'll technically work, right? It'll do a yum update on fictitiously Java. So let's say I failed whatever this rule is. It's clearly something about Java. Is it a good or a bad idea to just arbitrarily update Java? Like you run into these issues. So that gets us into like a lifecycle management talk of, we do have tools that will tell you, oh, you have a web server installed. Don't randomly update Java because you have 5 web apps that might be affected. There are tooling for that. Tripwire makes one as well. But it's something to be noteful of. Sorry, I just got married, so I put all my background as the bride. Yes, and she hates me because now I'm here. So, what do we stepped through kind of actually quite a bit, and I'm trying to recap in my mind. We talked about automated reports. We did a couple demos. We showed the profiles. So right now, out of curiosity, is it mostly DoD stig? I mean, half people are in uniform, right? So, are you guys waiting on the Red Hat 7 stig? Have you heard about that? So part of this is the last 5 minutes. Part of what we end up doing is right now DoD has published security guidance for Red Hat 5 and 6, which are they're actually our older versions. The most recent one is called Red Hat 7. It came out roughly 1.5 years ago. So we have 2 bodies of security content. So the first is what's called a vendor stig. It's basically Red Hat self-attesting that, we go through all the DoD requirements. We get some peer review from NSA and we just ship it. That's what's available now. It's fine. It's DoD authorized. What we've been waiting for 2.5 years is DISA to publish like a DISA FSO stig. That we just released. We just ended our public comment period last Friday. So 3-4 days ago. And then the final should be published to DISA.mil in theory by the 3rd week of August. So that's roughly August 21st. So for those who are waiting on it, roughly, pending any government delays and, generic hand waving about the government schedule, no offense, roughly the 3rd week of August. And then the other thing that we're coming out with is OpenStack stigs. So we're trying to do kind of a handful of, what should we do next, right? The Linux stuff just gets published. Should we do Docker? Should we do OpenStack? Are either of these being used in your shops today? What about for virtualization? Does it just move to JIE? Move to C2S? VMware? Cool, that's fine. So yeah, other than that, I think we're actually right at time. So I did have to fly through, and I'll be around if you guys want to chat. But any other last minute questions?
Additional questions?